Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Panel 1, Session 3. My name is Hannes McNulty, and I'm your panel leader for this Session 3, which is called Taking the Pulse of Key Industry Program Approaches. Now, before I jump into the introduction of the panelists in this topic, I would actually like to quickly explain what Panel 1 is actually about. Panel 1 is titled Policies and Programs to Drive Transformation. And this panel is in particular looking at how we need to bring about a step change in the way we design policies and programs to address the challenge of reaching 2050 decarbonization targets. And to do this, we need to consider how we connect the economics of business with the reality of climate change. Now, this is a big challenge for all of us, and energy efficiency plays a big role on this. So this panel is really about answering two key questions. The first question is about how can we deliver a more effective multi-stakeholder approach in designing more effective transformative policies and programs on decarbonization. And the second question really focuses on the other elements of decarbonization, in addition to, say, the core element of energy efficiency. Energy efficiency might be extremely important to decarbonization, but we shouldn't be looking at it in isolation. We should be considering how to interconnect it with other key elements such as financing, emerging technologies, and of course, renewable energy. So those are the kind of two key, let's say, questions that underpin this particular panel. Panel 1, yes. So this session, Taking the Pulse of Key Industry Program Approaches, is looking at some very interesting presentations from our 4 speakers. Now, what I will do is quickly introduce our speakers. We have Dario Santo, who is going to be discussing white certificates in industry. We have Tadeusz Skoczkowski, who's going to be speaking about evaluating the Polish white certificate scheme. We have André de Fontaine, who's talking about drawing insights and best practices from voluntary energy efficiency agreements in Europe and the United States. We have Jakob Mau Pedersen, who will be talking about the development of the voluntary agreement system in the Ukraine. So quite an interesting lineup, and very importantly, building upon some very interesting discussions we had yesterday, which focused a lot on getting information from industry and understanding the industry perspective and sharing knowledge. So before we jump into the presentations themselves, I would like to just let you, the audience, know of something very important. We will be having the 4 presentations, one after the other. And straight after, we will go into the discussion. That means all the questions that you, the audience, will have for us. What I would ask you is please collect your questions in the Q&A section, not the chat section, but the Q&A section. And we will use those questions to form the discussion with the speakers after the different presentations. So without further ado, let's jump into the first presentation from Dario Santo. Dario, if I can please pass over to you. Many thanks.
So, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here to another eceee industrial conferences. I have a possibility to attend to them all, and it's always a nice and useful thing to do. I work for the Italian Federation for the Rational Use of Energy, that we pronounce FIRE, and FIRE made a lot of things dealing with energy efficiency and energy management. We manage the Italian Energy Manager Network, and we are active on many initiative actions and projects dealing with these topics. Today, I will speak of white certificates, not as a scheme in general. You will find a useful paper on last year eceee conference if you want that, but on a particular topic, which is a possibility to use metered savings with white certificates. So, first of all, white certificates in Italy is an energy efficiency obligation, of course. Obliged parties are electricity and gas distributors with more than 50,000 users. and they can directly obtain white certificates or buy them from voluntary parties, which are over distributors, ESCOs, and end user, either with an energy management expert or an energy management system. Each certificate corresponds to 1 ton of oil equivalent of primary energy saved, and certificates are got from 3 to 10 years according to the complexity of a project. All sectors are eligible. The numbers are very huge. We got over 27 megaton of oil equivalent since the start of the scheme. And the interesting part is are that 61% of those savings have been metered. And this is something peculiar in our scheme. Also interesting is the capability to promote manufacturing process. And also the industrial sector is the leading sector in our scheme with about 60% of energy efficiency measures of the scheme. It is also an old scheme, and that's interesting. So going to the focus. The measurement of energy efficiency is quite difficult because unfortunately we don't have an energy efficiency meter. So we have to measure ex ante consumption, ex post consumption, and also the adjustment factors like weather, production, building occupancy, and so on. And this is of course an issue when we think about energy efficiency policy. And the reason why most policies used either demand saving approaches or engineering estimates, because they simplify this kind of assessment. In Italy, instead, since 2017, we just have metered savings, which were used since the beginning, by the way, and they are in line with IPMVP protocol part B, if you know what it is. So we really assess the real savings in our scheme. That means that we start from the ex ante baseline, we adjust it through the correct factors, and we compare it with ex post consumption. Now, the interesting part is that until 2017, we also addressed additionality incorporated with a per project basis. So the eligible savings were not the difference between the ex post consumption and the adjusted baseline, but we have to take into account the minimum between the average of the actual installed park and or a standard requirement. For example, in industry, it could be best available techniques linked to BREFs. That means that usually the eligible savings were a little bit lower than the global savings linked to a certain project. In the industrial sector, in fact, it wasn't a serious issue because many times the average of the installed park was more or less in line with the ex ante situation in the companies that was doing the energy efficiency action. In the service sector, instead, these eligible savings were usually very low if compared to the global savings due to minimum requirements. In 2017, the ministry decided to change this approach, and it decided to introduce a very strict additionality based not on the installed park, but on the supply. And so that means, for example, if you implement an LED intervention, the reference value was LED on the market. And that meant you got very few certificates for mostly of the possible projects. Since this was really too strict, in 2018, it was changed again. And it was decided also to put additionality out of a per project basis. So now it is evaluated afterwards or ex ante by the ministry deciding what kind of energy efficiency action are eligible to the scheme in general, but not on a per project basis, unless you're dealing with a new installation and not on ex post consumption. So presently, the eligible savings correspond, in case of substitution, with the global savings that can be linked to a given energy efficiency action. This of additionality was a good thing because additionality created a lot of issues in terms of evaluation and litigation between the managing authority, which in Italy is GSE, and the proponents. So this kind of approach is complicated, obviously, because it requires to meter everything, ex ante, ex post, adjustment factors. But it gives also a lot of benefits. So if we compare DMET savings approach, for example, with monitoring plan approach, we can see that first, this method is complex, this is true, but it can be dealt with, especially with average projects that you will find in industry, which are medium or large size. Secondly, the savings are measured, and this gives a lot of benefits. First of all, because you have the real savings, not estimated ones. Secondly, because it gives a lot of information to the managing authority. Another interesting point is that the risk of frauds is really low with this approach. And also that the effort, the additional effort you require in case of proponents will be balanced by the possibility to get all the savings eligible. And from the managing authority point of view, that you don't need to do ex ante and ex post evaluation to evaluate the scenarios in which to create the DMET savings procedures. Of course, this complexity deals also with metering. In our scheme, since 2017, hourly meters are required, and this is of course an issue because not all the companies have these hourly meters already installed. And by the way, we are not speaking, of course, with the general meters or a company, but we are speaking of on-site meters, which are required in IPMBP option B to evaluate the savings. To simplify this, there is a guide written by the GSE that explains how to deal with ex ante baseline evaluation wherein you don't have 1 year of measures, whenever it is applicable. And also there are sectoral guidelines that helps to address ex ante baselines in all sectors. To conclude, we can say that meter savings, of course, are complicated in a sense, but they can be used. I suggest that the best situation is the best option is that you use them together with DMET savings approaches. Additionality can be difficult to evaluate on a per project basis, and this is the reason why, especially in the industrial sector that doesn't have a lot of standardization, it is better not to deal with that at a per project basis, but consider it at a global level. The fact to go with the IPMBP option B is very good because it means you really measure the real savings. And this high quality MMB improves project qualities, improves the know-how both of end users and operators like ESCOs, utilities, and other suppliers, and gives a lot of valuable data to managing authorities. You can see that, for example, in the UMercy project, which creates some years ago a platform available at umercy.eu, which allowed to create say files for every type of good practices available in the industrial sector thanks also to all this information we gathered through this approach. Of course, high quality MMV needs support, both in terms of information and training, and in continuous dialogue and communication among the parties. The flexibility should be granted in terms of meters. That's because it's also a pillar of the IPMVP approach, even if in our scheme we decided for the strict hourly meters approach, but it doesn't pay. And last, finding out the right mix between easy to use and strictness is important. And using both limit savings approaches or oversimplified approaches and metered savings is very good to give you all the benefits which are possible in these cases. It is better to use them both because, by the way, if you have a scheme with a tradable market like ours, meter savings can create issues because they need time from the time in which you get the price signal, a rising price signal, to the time in which you get the certificates on the market, because you need the measurements and not just to implement the energy efficiency measure. To conclude with, I just want to highlight the ESMO project, which aims at supporting managing authorities, ministries, and other policymakers dealing with the design and the implementation of energy efficiency policies under Article 7 of the EED. And so please have a look at it if you don't know it already, and enjoy the possibility of support that we give to you till the end. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy this session.
Many thanks, Dario, and also many thanks for your excellent timekeeping. That's very much appreciated. It's always great when the first presenter sets the standard for the others to come. Now, I would say to the audience, please, again, consider your questions and put them in the Q&A section of the Whova app that you have. We will collect them and put them to the speakers after these presentations. So up next, we have Tadeusz Skoczkowski, who is presenting on evaluating the Polish White Certificate Scheme. Over to you, Tadeusz, please. Tadeusz, you will have to unmute yourself and start to speak, please. Tadeusz, you still have your microphone on mute.
Hello?
Yes, now it's good.
Yes, sorry for that. I click on this microphone, but it doesn't work. So I will say that I'm very glad here to be with you at last at this conference. Today I will talk a little bit about the Polish White Certificates screen, and I will concentrate on this evaluations of these systems. Because I say in plural systems, because of schemes, we have in Polish, in fact, two schemes, and this is that I would like to show that there was a radical change in the schemes, and I would like to illustrate what was the outcome, what was the impact of this radical change. And well, do I see? Okay, I would like to change. Okay, now you see the first the outline of this presentation, and as you see here, I'm going to talk about the two energy efficiency acts. One on 2011, the second was introduced into law 5 years later. Then overview of these two schemes, the results, lessons learned, and recommendations. Unfortunately, I will have no time to to talk about the details of these two schemes, but I think that I hope that my presentation will be understandable for you. Next slide, please, because I don't see how to change the slides myself. May I have the next slide, please? Energy efficiency actions, because this is something which, yes, this is Energy Efficiency Acts. As you see here, we, well, the previous slide, okay, this is the right slide, thank you. As you see here, we have the two systems, as I said. The first came into action in 2011, but it was operational since the beginning 2013. So as you see here, there was a gap delay of 1.5 years between the act came into force and the operational stage of this white certificates system. So as you see here, it took pretty long to get ready with these administrative issues with this scheme. And then we have the second Energy Efficiency Act, and it came into 2017. And as you see here, the system was radically revised. It means that you will see the changes, and also you will see what were the changes for these people who were active in market involvement in this. May I have the next slide, please? Yes, this is a simplified flow chart of the white certificate system 1. And the core point, it was the public auction. It was, the system was designed in this way that there would be a public auction without going into details. It was devised in this way that only the, I would say, the cheapest energy savings were granted with the white certificates. If the savings were too expensive, then the system would eliminate them. However, this system was very complicated, and then it was one of the main reasons why it was changed. As you see here, the operator of the system, it was the Energy Regulatory Office. I may say that the office was not at the beginning prepared for managing the system, but then they have to learn by doing, by gaining experience. There was also a very crucial element of this system, I mean verification of the system. It was an excellent introduction to this problem of measurement and verification made by Dario. So however, I will not concentrate on this. However, as we understand, this is the crucial element in all this weight certificate system, how to measure the actual savings and how to verify the savings exposed. Of course, these white certificates in Poland are tradable. We have the energy power exchange, so that the certificates were tradable. Then we have the new Energy Efficiency Acts, and you see here what we changed here. The auctioning system was removed. As I said, it was too complicated, and then it was decided to change to quite a different system. I'm going to tell you about, however, they also changed that now the white certificates are valued in final energy. Earlier they were in primary energy. We also include the now the installations, ETC installation are eligible in the new system. And also there is such a possibility in both systems that for those who failed to submit the white certificates, the obliged party who failed to do that, they can pay the substitution fee. However, in this second system, the possibility to pay, to use the substitution fee was much eliminated, limited. And also there was another important that there was increasing price for white certificates. As you see here, every year, the price increased by 5%. The next one, it is the, oh, sorry, yes, this one, thank you. This is the white certificate system now, the two, and even not going into details, we see that the flow chart each March simplified. As you see here, we have the Energy Regulatory Office, but the auction has disappeared. So now it is that all these energy efficiency investment are eligible for receiving white certificates. Also, the verification methodology of these savings were much simplified. We have a random energy audit check made by the Energy Regulatory Office. The next one, please. And this is why, what are the objectives? What we assumed, we reduced the complexity of the market actors involved in the system, so it was also a lower market risk. We disallowed projects already carried out from beginning, funded through the energy efficiency obligation, what lowers the risk of not additional savings and free ridership. So it means now the parties, the obliged parties, can be granted with these white certificates only for these investments which are planned, not for those which were already carried out. And there was also some consequences of the switching from primary energy to secondary energy. The next one, sorry, in this, the previous slide, please. Okay, yes, in this slide, as you see here, we have a comparison of the first and the second period. No time to discuss, but you can see here that we have also penalty for not compliance. There is a minimum project size. It is 10 TOE savings per year. And also, as you see here, we have some mechanism of this buyout price. Earlier, as I said, it was fixed buyout price. Now it has the buyout price increased by 5% per year. And the next one, it is, I click on this, and the next one, please. Yeah, it takes. And now I will show a few slides, very few. What are the consequences for all these people who are involved in this game, in this market game? And as you see here, final energy savings. As you see, final energy savings in the first system, we had 5 auctions, only 5 auctions once a year. Such an auction was announced by the regulatory office, by president of this office. And as you see here, auction by auction, the amount of the savings increased. But then in 2017, as I said, there was a radical, abrupt change. I think that nobody was aware of this change, so the market was surprised to see the next day such a radical change of the rules. However, there was also reaction, and this reaction, as you see here, the market had to adapt to the new rules, and it is visible here by the substantial decrease of the energy savings. The next one, I think, please, yes. And now, as you see here, we have the forecast of cumulative final energy savings from these two systems. It was the data we used for our considerations assessment. It was up to 2018, and we have also the forecast for the 2 years, 2019 and 2020. And what you see here, this is the target of Poland, the green color, and the blue one, it is what is reported by the regulatory office, and the orange one, yes, I think it's orange. This is our estimation, which savings can be can follow into the obligations of Article 7 of the EED directive, so that, as you see here, there is a substantial difference. This is that the savings, which are, according to our estimations, are much lower than the savings officially reported by the office. The reason for this is that the durations of this lifetime span of this energy efficiency measures, if we take into account the recommendation by the Commission, then the savings are substantially reduced. The next one, please. And yes, also see the cumulative final energy savings up to the year 2040. It is also our estimation from our numerical model, as you see here. If we keep the same trend, because these estimations for the future are based, the trend of savings will be kept at the same rate as it is now. As you see here, there would be a substantial decrease of the savings, and it is likely that Poland will not meet the 2030 objectives of the Commission. The next one, and yes, and here you see the average price of the certificates, and from this graph you see that the market was highly unstable. There was a lot of anxiety in this market. The regulations, as I said, the new regulations came suddenly out of the blue, and there was immediate reaction to the market. There was all the supply of this certificates on the market, and it is reflected in this way. And of course, the assessment of this picture must be very sad, because it shows that the risk, the business risk, the people involved remains high. And the next slide, this is what was the concern. This is the monitoring, the verification. It remains a problem, not only in Italy, but also in Poland. And I think that it is the weakest point of this system, the most difficult element. However, in Poland, it is the weakest moment. The other problem we face here, it is that we have no official specification of the lifetimes. It was left for the discretion of these energy auditors, and it should be changed, of course. There is also a lack of independent evidence-based evaluation of the energy efficiency obligations. I think that we need such independent check. And also there was not a requirement to prove additionality. It is also one of the key elements of the well-functioning of the system, and it was also not fully addressed in our system. And the last one, please, the next slide. These are the recommendations. Ensure that the obliged parties meet their targets through enforcement and the use of penalties as appropriate. Introduce much stricter regulation of ex-post monitoring and verification. Introduce additional policies to deliver new savings, because now we can say that the system of white certificates, it is the fundamental, the only system we have in Poland to meet the obligation of Article 7. And now the government plans to introduce also the additional measures, and also the system lacks transparency. The data is missing. The public data is hardly available. Very few data pieces is available for us, and plans for the future, new legislation in process, continuation of white certificates as possible, with possible changes. It is the decision, political decision, which has already been taken. There would be also in future white certificates as a key energy efficiency measure in Poland. And we also plan, I mean, the government plans to introduce the alternative measures. And I can say that all these three items, the plans for the future, recently, I think it was last week, they were introduced in the new draft of the energy efficiency law, which was tabled by the government for public discussion. So we can say that our works maybe have some contribution to the policy of this of Poland's government. So it was very short assessment of evaluation of the Polish schemes. If you want to learn more, there was a article published recently in Energy Policy. Me and Jan Rosenov, who is well known in energy efficiency circles, were the main authors of this. So I like to thank you very much for your attention, and I think that I am still in the time limits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tadeusz. That was very much appreciated. And I have to admit, you went 1 minute over, so I'm going to, but you were close to your time limit, so don't worry. Next up, we have André de Fontaine, who is going to speak on drawing insights and best practices from voluntary energy efficiency agreements in Europe and the United States. André, I hand over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Hannes, and thank you everybody for joining this afternoon or morning, wherever you're calling from. As Hannes noted, I will be talking about voluntary energy efficiency agreements in Europe and the United States, and then trying to draw some insights and best practices and maybe a little bit of comparison between programs in those two continents. I'll note that I developed this presentation in partnership with Erwin Cornelis, my colleague. We had a voluntary agreement between the two of us to do this together. He has a lot of experience with these programs in Europe, and I manage some of them in the United States. So I am not going to spend a lot of time on this introductory slide, assuming that I can get it to go to the next slide. Okay, I skipped one. There's a bit of a lag. It's always the hazard with these systems. So what is a voluntary agreement? I think everybody, this is a very well-educated audience, so I think everybody probably knows what these are, but basically they're agreements that are reached between government and industry. And it doesn't always have to be government. I mean, we do see some non-governmental organizations that manage voluntary agreements, but the focus of this presentation is really government to industry partnerships, which specify energy efficiency commitments and time schedules for the industry to meet. Voluntary agreements have grown and spread. The IEA lists more than 300 of these globally across different continents. And one of the reasons why these are popular and increasing in popularity is that, you know, the design and the implementation are flexible, and they can be tailored to meet local conditions. So as I noted, the focus of this presentation is really to look at different models of voluntary agreements that have been utilized both in the US and in Europe. Now that's of course not the only places in the world where these have been used. We do have a couple of examples within these slides of some programs that have been developed in Asia, but because I'm trying to be very compliant with the time limits, I will warn you that I will be very unlikely to have enough time to discuss the Asian programs in any real detail. So the focus is really going to be on the US and Europe. And as we assess these models, there's basically 4 criteria that we'll be looking at. One is the authority level where the agreements are implemented. So it could be federal, it could be at the member state level, and sometimes it's subnational at the local government level. And then we'll also be looking at the nature of the goal setting itself, whether that's a public voluntary program, which is an example of where the government authority sets a target itself, and then industry is challenged to agree to that target or not. There's also a unilateral form of agreement, which is essentially the flip side of that, where industry makes a commitment itself. And then there's a bit of a hybrid, which is the negotiated approach, where industry and government together collaborate and negotiate a goal that they can both agree to. We'll be looking at how knowledge sharing is encouraged or facilitated within the voluntary agreements, which are very important. And then lastly, another criteria is the measurement and verification, which is important and also an area where we think there's some divergence that's noteworthy between the US and European programs. Let's start first in the United States with some examples of voluntary programs that have been established there. This is my tableau of US voluntary programs. It's really just a smattering of examples throughout the US. I think voluntary programs on energy and environment really began in the 1990s. There's a program called the Green Lights Program, which was essentially focused on getting commercial building owners and operators to implement cost-effective lighting programs. That then evolved into what became known as the Energy Star program. I think many people know Energy Star due to the labeling program to help consumers identify energy efficient products on the marketplace. But they also manage a very robust industrial voluntary energy efficiency program where companies do make energy efficiency commitments. More recently, programs like Better Buildings, which is what I was involved in at the Department of Energy, have been implemented, which set as a blanket goal, basically a 20% energy efficiency target over 10 years. Those are on the demand side. There are also on the supply side, encouraging the utilization of on-site renewable energy sources. That's through EPA's Green Power Partnership. And then we've also seen some more specific targeted programs, for example, Green Chill, which is focused specifically on refrigeration in grocery stores. And then on climate change more broadly, 2 programs which are no longer in existence, Climate Vision, which took a sectoral approach, trying to work with trade associations to get entire industrial sectors to set commitments. And then Climate Leaders, which took the similar approach in goal setting, negotiated goals, but on a company by company basis. And then you also see different media, for example, waste, and then on transportation, freight in particular. So I offer this up just to show that there are a number of different voluntary programs in the US, different structures, different goals, and they've been around for several decades actually, and those span political administrations. Now, because we are at an energy efficiency conference focused on industry, I want to zoom in on the 2, what I consider to be the more prominent energy efficiency partnership programs in the US that do have strong industrial components, Better Buildings and Energy Star. I refer to these as platform-based voluntary programs, and the reason why I do so is that they are, the platform itself is this energy efficiency commitment, which is reached between industry and government. But a hallmark of both of these programs is that they evolve over time. They build on that initial commitment. There's a certain degree of trust which develops between industry and government, and then knowledge is then exchanged between the parties. And you begin to see evolutions. The program develops supporting infrastructure around the goal setting to help the partners achieve their goals. And this comes in the form of things like peer-to-peer learning with a web-based repository of different solutions, different short-term initiatives that focus on particular barriers, and then also large conferences where people come together, like what we're doing, although virtually. I'm sure they're doing that today too, to share their best practices and solutions with each other. And then technical tools also grow out of these voluntary programs. Again, it's the knowledge and the issues that are shared between industry and government that then allows the government to develop targeted tools to meet the needs of industry. And some of the examples we've seen in the US are tools built around financing, implementation of ISO 50001, and then some benchmarking tools as well. My last point on the US programs, and we'll get a little bit more into detail about this in a moment, is on MRV. I think this is an area of divergence between the US and the EU. I think all programs are going to have to find a balance on MRV between rigorous third-party verification versus less expensive, less intrusive, self-reported data. To date, the US has taken more of what I call the collaborative validation, less expensive, a little bit less intrusive, but there may be opportunities to become a little bit more rigorous over time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Europe. I think the key takeaways here are voluntary agreements are certainly well established within Europe, starting especially in Northwest Europe and now spreading in Central Europe. In the EU, most voluntary agreements are negotiated, meaning that the industry and government agree on targets in a collaborative process. There have also been public schemes as well as unilateral commitments, but generally the unilateral commitments have not been found to have performed as well. All the voluntary agreements are conducted at the national level. So that's at the member state level. There is no, to our knowledge, European Union-wide voluntary program in place. On the MRV, this is where, as I mentioned, the EU has taken a more rigorous approach. The public authorities are in charge of making sure that companies are making progress so that the data coming in is valid. Usually strict rules are in place with respect to annual reporting, and then sometimes a requirement that an energy audit report be submitted as well. Various indicators are used to track progress. I think all of us in the energy efficiency community know that there's multiple different ways of measuring energy efficiency. And to go back to what I said earlier about how these programs can be tailored to local conditions, different countries use different metrics to track progress based on the goals that they've set for those programs. And then many countries do have a dedicated verification office, which I think is suggestive of the level of resources that they put into this action. And it also allows for a dedicated office that can ensure the confidentiality of the data that's being reported by the companies, which is quite important. On knowledge sharing, this is an area where I think that the US has historically been a little further ahead of the EU. However, we are beginning to see it grow in Europe. I think initially the focus was on compliance with the targets itself, but I think the realization has grown now that these are great platforms. These types of programs are great platforms to encourage knowledge sharing, since there's not the threat of regulation. Companies can come together in a more collaborative process and share their learnings with one another. And I will stay true to my word and true to the timekeeping by quickly skipping over the Asia voluntary agreements. I will just note that these are in the slides and that there are certainly examples of voluntary agreements, both in India as well as China. But I did want to leave time to do a little bit of discussion of what I see as some of the key takeaways when you look at US versus EU voluntary agreements. So going back to those 4 criteria that we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, when we look at where these agreements are set or implemented, in the US, they're typically done at the federal level. So that's at the US level. Whereas in the EU, they're done nationally or at the member state level. This, Erwin and I believe, has some implications for the way that these agreements are ultimately structured and carried out. The US is obviously a very big country. There's lots going on there. And so when you set a voluntary agreement at the national level, it means you're covering a lot of ground, both geographically, but then also you're potentially pulling in a lot of diverse participants, where in the member state level in the EU, certainly there's very large European countries as well, but there is greater opportunity for the governing authority to be closer to the client, to have a little bit more direct engagement with the participants. This has implications, we believe, for the way that the goals end up being set. So if you look in the US, most of the voluntary agreements are public voluntary agreements, meaning that the governing authority sets the goal and then industry agrees or doesn't to go along with that. And you can see how that would be a more efficient way of doing things if you are covering such wide ground and such a varied list of participants. Whereas in the EU, when these are done at the member state level, again, being a little bit closer to the client, there's greater opportunity to negotiate directly with the participants and arrive at a mutually agreeable goal. On knowledge sharing, as I mentioned earlier, this is an area where we do think that the US voluntary agreements have been stronger historically. In fact, I would argue that in many cases, the knowledge sharing elements are emphasized to a greater degree than the actual energy efficiency commitments themselves. But now we are seeing the EU begin to move more aggressively on knowledge sharing, which I've seen also has been a topic of conversation at this conference as well. And then back on MRV, again, just to kind of repeat myself a little bit, the US has taken a relatively lighter touch on verification. Now, I think one of the reasons for this is that in the EU, you see a dynamic where voluntary agreements are sometimes used as substitutes, or they're paired with regulations, where companies are given the option of enrolling in a voluntary agreement as a way of avoiding regulatory compliance or a tax. And so you can see how that dynamic really does not currently exist in the US. And you can see that when a voluntary agreement is used in substitute for a regulation, it does raise the stakes for participation in the voluntary agreement, and it does suggest that you want to be a little bit more careful with the MRV to make sure that people are really doing what they said they would do. Whereas in the US, these are really framed more as voluntary leadership programs, and therefore the MRV is perhaps a little bit less critical. And this is my last slide. I think one of the questions that sometimes comes up with voluntary agreements is how can these coexist with regulations, especially, I think most of us assume that due to the climate change challenge, we're likely to see climate and energy policies continue to evolve to become more stringent or more wide-ranging. I do think voluntary programs can coexist with regulations in a few ways of doing this. You have to be somewhat thoughtful about it, but voluntary programs can target sectors that are not covered by regulation. One example would be targeting large commercial buildings or light industry that are not already covered in the EU ETS. Of course, regulations do a really good job of identifying the minimum acceptable level of performance, but voluntary agreements can challenge industry to go beyond that. We talked about this a moment ago, but voluntary agreements can also be used as performance-based flexible alternatives to regulation. And then lastly, even within a regulatory context, you can use voluntary agreements for knowledge sharing. And so with that, I will close and turn it back over to Hannes.
Many thanks, Andre, and I thank you for excellent timekeeping. You're on the button, perfect. So thank you for that. What I would like to put out to the audience at this stage before we jump into the last presentation is I have heard monitoring, reporting, and verification as a very important point raised in all three presentations. And I think this should really form a key part of our discussion that will follow after the last presentation. So please, to the audience and maybe also to the panelists as well, if you have a particular input on this or a particular question on MRV, please put it up and let's have a kind of a discussion on that within the next 15 minutes. So to wrap up with the last presentation, we have Jakob, who is going to speak about the development of voluntary agreement system in the Ukraine. So Jakob, please, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannes. And thank you everyone for joining for this presentation. I will talk about a VA scheme that is currently being developed in the Ukraine. It's very much in the first stages. So at the moment we are seeing inspiration from other kind of schemes around the world, and we think we have a really exciting project going on. So I'm really looking forward to give this presentation. My name is Jakob Mau Pedersen. I work as a consultant in Copenhagen at a firm called Viegand Maagøe. All right, so the introduction. Okay, so the main challenge you can say in the Ukraine is that the energy intensity is rather high. So we believe it's like 3 to 4 times higher than the EU average, and that the companies in the Ukraine have potential to reduce energy consumption substantially, around 30 to 50%, depending on the specific sectors. So countries worldwide have introduced various support schemes targeting energy efficiency improvements. And like the main future of these schemes is to reimburse part of the costs that are associated with implementing these energy efficiency measures. In other words, we believe that you should incentivize the companies to adjust like their investments and to carry out energy efficiency measures that will reduce the overall energy consumption. And as an additional benefit, they will also reduce the emissions of CO2. So this project, it has been developed in a bilateral framework. So Viegand Maagøe, we have collaborated with a center that has been established. It's called the Ukraine-Denmark Energy Center. We have also collaborated with the Ukrainian as well as Danish authorities. And the overall objective has been to investigate how a voluntary agreement scheme should be implemented in the Ukraine. So, as Andre noted, it's rather complicated to introduce a scheme such as a VA scheme, and therefore we have we believe that we should try to implement it in 2 different stages. So we have a first stage, and this is where we plan to introduce a simplified grant model. So we denoted model 1. And the purpose of this model is that enterprises should gain support or financial support. And this support should actually be distributed by the banks. And the banks that get the funds from the state agency. And that differs from a stage 2 model. That is a more classic voluntary agreement scheme. And this is where the state agency of Ukraine will have or assume a more or a larger role in this scheme, and they will actually distribute the funds without any help from the financial institutions. I will elaborate on this further in my presentation, but I would just like to explain that in this presentation I will focus on the stage 1 grant model. So that is a simplified grant model, as a stage 2 model still needs to be developed. All right, so actually this work, it started back in 2007, and I think it's fair to say that we still have a lot of work to do. So in the energy strategy of Ukraine, it was published back in 2017. In the strategy, it was stated that the energy efficiency should increase dramatically, and the share of renewable energy should increase by 12%. And based on this energy strategy, we developed like a roadmap for the scheme, and we began on initial assessments of how this scheme would actually work and how we can incentivize the companies to carry out the right type of energy efficiency projects. In 2018, we also prepared some draft laws and concept reports. Last year, I think like the main work was done. We did modeling, calculations, and guidelines. Of course, like this scheme, it puts it focuses or it targets the enterprises, and therefore it's important like to increase the transparency, that we have some guidelines and that the enterprises actually know how this the scheme will work, and they will know how they can actually gain support, financial support. In 2017, all right, in 2020, we are like developing these guidelines, and we expect to arrange workshops with companies and financial institutions and gather information from key stakeholders that we expect will be involved in the scheme. And we will also proceed with the work on draft laws. As far as I know, I don't believe that these draft laws has been passed in the Ukrainian parliament, but we hope they will, and we can actually we believe that this project it carries so much potential and great potential. So we believe that in case this project is actually passed by the Ukrainian parliament, it will bring great benefits. So we hope for the best. All right, so this is just to tell you a little bit more about the contents of the scheme. The scheme is 100% funded by the tax on carbon fuel usage. And we expect that the revenues will be equivalent to 38 million euros annually. So the main principle is that the state agency that will actually collect the funding is the tax, or actually the tax authorities, they collect the funding, they distribute it to the state agency, and the state agency distribute the funds further on in the chain to the financial institution, and the financial institution, they will provide the funding to the participating enterprises. Of course, like, it's not all companies that can access these funds, so they have to conduct an energy audit, and they have to present a project with a payback between 1 and 5 years that the enterprises should be deemed to be creditworthy by the financial institution. And in that case, if all these criteria are fulfilled, then a loan agreement between the two parties is signed. So first a loan agreement is signed, and afterwards it's possible for the enterprises to have some of these loan or the capex cost reimbursed, and that process will also be taken care of by the financial institutions. So the scheme will be open to all enterprises with a high level of energy consumption, and the enterprise should also be subject to the carbon tax. So the main responsibility of the financial institution is to assess the creditworthiness of the companies, and the main responsibility of the companies, you can say, is to actually make sure that they have a really good project and they are deemed to be creditworthy. The energy audit should comply with the ISO 50001 certificate, so it should comply with the international standards. The payback should be between 1 and 5 years. All right, so this is a company size because there's other kind of legislations that are enforced in Ukraine. So like there's anti-monopoly legislations that kind of sets the limits on how much of the capital costs can actually be reimbursed. And these these different levels of company size, the company size is measured in terms of revenue and employees. So here you have the reimbursement rate, and the maximum grant is also stated. And the main objective is actually to provide it to as many companies as possible to try to gather information on how this scheme will actually work and find empirical data. Okay, so this is the flow chart. So what happens is that the state agency, they decide to stretch the funds. The funds are then distributed to the banks, and they are dispersed in tranches. The company signs up for a loan, sends a loan application to the bank. In case the bank accepts the loan, the company will have funds to finance their project. After this stage, the company will report some key data to the bank, and then the bank will compensate 50% of the total reimbursement. This is the first phase. During the second phase, to incentivize the companies to provide final project data, the companies will or will have an extra incentive and will receive extra or the remaining 20% of the reimbursement in case they actually report the final project data. And from this stage, the bank will report the data to the state agency, and the state agency will have like basis for developing this stage 2 voluntary agreement scheme model that I introduced before. So this is rather complex task to do. So right now we have a lot of work, and it's, as I said before, it's a draft. So we don't know exactly how much this scheme will incentivize the different companies, but we will put like main focus on providing new guidelines and making templates for application and designing a database for collecting implementation of data. And we also need some amendments to the legislations of the Ukraine. And we expect this project to contribute with a number of positive externalities. Like one is increased energy efficiency. Another one is this increased security of supply. A third one is reduced local and global air pollution. So there are many benefits from this project. So what we are doing right now is that we are monitoring the political processes in the Ukraine. And we hope that we, as soon as possible, will be able to continue our work and to finalize this stage 1 voluntary agreement scheme, so we can actually incentivize the Ukrainian enterprises to carry out beneficial energy efficiency projects. All right, so that's all. Thank you very much.
Jakob, thank you very much. And this has been a very good, we'll say, wrap up to the presentations. I'll just ask you very quickly, Jakob, if you could put yourself on mute, that would be much appreciated. Thank you very much. Now, what we do here at this stage is we move directly into the questions so that we have a good discussion. And there have been a number of questions already posted on our screen. So what I'll do is jump straight to the first question, which was asked early on. And this was a question asked by Rod, directed at Dario. And his question was, there are concerns that the white certificate scheme in Italy possibly could be removed for industry. Is there any chance of this happening? And Dario, there is actually another question for you that I'll throw in at the same time, if that's okay, because I think it's a simple one. The question is asked by Cyril: how many evaluators actually work on this ex post verification for how many projects every year? So maybe if you could answer those two questions in one go, perhaps.
Yeah, of course. So according to the first question, no, there is no risk that in the industrial sector will be taken away from the white certificate scheme, because it's the main one. The problem was the opposite in case. But presently the idea is to maintain all the sector available, and a new decree is waited in the next 2 months, which will set the targets till 2023, I think. And that will introduce many news in order to allow the scheme to restart with more effectiveness. With respect to the second question, so I don't know the exact number presently. I can say that at the apex, for example, between 2011 and 2013, there were around 25 evaluators. And the amount of proposals or metering proposals was around 1,000 and a half per year. But there were also 10,000 requests for verification linked both with monitoring plan projects and with DMET saving projects. Afterwards, the scheme a little bit, let's say, collapsed, because presently we have around 130 proposal per year. In the industrial sector, so it is a little bit more than 1/10 than in 2015, and around 1,000 total requests, so also 1/10. So for sure there are less evaluators presently, but I don't know how much. In any case, we start at the beginning with 3 evaluators the first years. So you need to accommodate the number of evaluators over time, and this can be a challenge, especially if you plan to do it by public resources, so people working directly on public authorities, instead of trying to involve also private third-party actors that can help the public sector to evaluate the project.
Right, thank you very much. And sticking to, let's say, the white certificates, Tadeusz, there's a question for you asked by Erwin. And his question is there a cap on investment size or a maximum set to prevent that one project would allow the obligated party to fulfill his obligation and blocking room for other small projects? Were you able to understand that question?
Yes, I can answer that. No, there is no such a cap, and there is no limit for the size of this energy efficiency. When we had the previous system, which is a little bit historical, but maybe it is worth to mention, that there was for each of this auction, there was a limited number of these white certificates. So of course, there in this way, their projects were limited from above. There was a boundary of this, but it was not a legal boundary imposed of any size of this energy efficiency project. So we can say no. No, there was, as I said, there was a lower boundary, 10 mega TOE saved per annum. So it was some limit which expelled the small energy savings, so there was no so much administrative burden posed on the operator of the system, however not the upper boundary. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Tadeusz.
Yeah.
Now, if for whatever reason the people asking these questions have additional questions, please do post them in the Q&A. I'll pick it up. But what I want to do is switch from the white certificates now to the voluntary agreement schemes that were presented. And we have a question here by Didier. And from what I understand, this would be more towards Andre to begin with. Andre, the question is, the main issue on voluntary agreement success is that the accompanying measures like subsidies or penalties, such as taxation, which support this type of voluntary agreement. You didn't mention this in your assessment. Can you elaborate on those type of main issues? Subsidies or penalties?
Yeah. Well, so I think it's a fair point. I think the way that you structure the incentives and disincentives to participating and then ultimately to complying will make a big difference in how the participants behave. No question about that. And then as far as the specifics, I guess let me try to answer this from the US perspective, and then maybe Erwin, I know he's lurking in the chat, can elaborate if needed. But you know, this question I think brings up a couple of themes that I brought up in the presentation. One is that voluntary agreements can be customized to local conditions, and sometimes those local conditions are political conditions. And then the second thing is sort of the interaction between voluntary programs and more traditional regulatory programs. I bring that up because in the US context, we would probably never use the word penalties, and certainly not taxation, in the context of a voluntary program. I think that if you're taxing or penalizing the participants for failure to make progress or failure to meet the voluntary target, it ceases to be voluntary, and then it becomes more of a regulatory instrument. I would argue the same is partially true for subsidies. To me, those end up being, you know, rebates, financial incentives that fall into a different bucket of policy category. So I bring that up because, and I do understand this is different between the EU and the US, but you know, when you talk about tailoring these programs to different local conditions, as I mentioned, you know, sometimes those conditions are political. In the US, voluntary agreements have been promoted and pursued as alternatives to regulations. And that's part of the reason why these programs have been able to grow over decades through different political administrations, because there is a political consensus around the non-regulatory nature of the voluntary agreement. So in the US, it's not to say that supporting incentives and disincentives are not relevant, but those tend to come more in the form of technical assistance and the peer-to-peer learning, not taxation and not subsidies.
It's a fair point, and actually what I will do is I actually have a question then for Jakob, a little bit related to that. Jakob, what you showed is that there is this two-stage approach for the voluntary agreement proposal for the Ukraine. The first one being very much related to, let's say, financing, and then the second one where they get more into long-term ambitions, etc. A question for you is, if there's this strong focus on let's just get out there and support them with financing solutions based on a project, just a specific project, would it not also make sense to have a longer term action plan in place before we start literally giving them subsidies, financial solutions, etc.? Or do you think it's actually okay to say we start with a project, get them motivated before we talk about the long-term ambition? What's the argument there?
I think it's a very good point, but it's also important for me to emphasize that from the beginning of this project, we had like a long run view on this, so we know that for now we have a very big or large need to incentivize the companies of Ukraine to reduce energy consumption. But in the longer term, we are also aware that we should not like incentivize or provide funding to companies who will invest in the energy efficiency measures that would be implemented anyway, even without any subsidy. So throughout this project, we have emphasized the need to collect the good data that can actually provide the basis for this stage 2 model. But I agree that that it's very important to evaluate carefully how the money are spent. You cannot spend the money twice. So yeah, we try as much as possible to also have to also like make a long-term strategy for this scheme. Yeah, but it's in this project we are actually doing both things at the same time. You can say we are developing a stage 1 model, and at the same time we are trying to analyze like what will be the data needs for the stage 2 model.
Okay, so if we consider that you're bringing up the points of data is important, motivation is important in doing that, I have a question here asked by Thomas, and I think this is really a question to the panel, because his question is, the biggest steps are often taken by companies being innovative, both connecting technology and the organization. What are the pros and cons with white certificates and voluntary agreements? Now, again, this is, I think, is a very generic question to the panel, but I think it's valid because I think what's behind here is we have the monitoring, reporting, and verification issue. We have how do we motivate the companies? We have the stick versus the carrot. Do we do more penalties, subsidies? How do we get them on board? And if we weigh these up, I mean, can we get an argument why white certificates are perhaps better than voluntary agreements, or vice versa, or should they be done actually in tandem and parallel? I don't know if one of you would like to quickly put up your hand to answer that. Now I don't have a visual on Andre.
Right,
Dario, you're going to take the challenge.
Yeah, it's not an easy challenge, but I mean, well, one main lesson learned is that usually innovative projects are not good to be incentivized through schemes aimed at the usual types of measures. And that's because many times innovative actions are not so cost effective. They don't have very short payback times. And so, for example, in our scheme, theoretically, you can place whatever you want. So there is space also for innovative projects. But you get 1 certificate per toy regarding your payback time. So, of course, the shorter the payback time of the action you implement, the higher the amount of money you get through white certificates. So it's a scheme that is created with the ripe fruit in mind, not with innovative actions in mind. And in this regard, maybe dedicated actions can be better, unless you make some modification to a scheme by introducing, for example, a bonus for innovative projects, like a multiplier, something like that, that can allow to use the same rule, for example, in terms of measurement and verification and so on, but that allows this kind of projects to get much more money than they will have with traditional rules.
Thank you, Dario. Perhaps a voluntary agreement person would like to counter this, push forward voluntary agreements as the ideal solution, or is there also a number of cons for the voluntary solutions? Andre, maybe you'd like to jump in on that one?
Well, I think I would not put forward voluntary agreements as the answer to all issues. I think they can be a useful complement. They can fill gaps. They can encourage leadership. But they are not, they should be utilized as a full portfolio of different policy measures, including more compliance-oriented measures, white certificates, subsidies, and also I think for innovation, I think really, public R&D funding is also critical in order to really push innovative technologies into the market. I think what we have seen with voluntary agreements that can sometimes encourage innovation is that at least in the US, and I think this is the case also in Europe, it really does take a look at the overall energy performance of the plant or the building itself. It's not focused on a specific measure or a specific piece of equipment. It does allow for the integration, energy management systems, sensors and controls. By taking the whole plant or whole building approach, it can allow for more system-wide energy efficiency measures that do reflect innovation. But I think that to get back to my earlier point, I am a supporter of voluntary agreements. I do not think that societies should rely on them alone to try to make progress on energy efficiency.
I think it's a theme I'm hearing throughout all the sessions. It's the variety of measures is what's going to support us rather than one individual type of measure. So I think you both in a way managed to answer that and confirm it in a way. What I noticed, Jakob, about the Ukraine system is that there was a particular focus on smaller and medium companies. And I think this is an interesting point to bring up and maybe expand upon, because we'll say, I won't say traditionally, but very often our white certificate schemes or voluntary agreements and other types of policies, they have a tendency to focus on the larger companies, or simply because they're the energy intensive ones. Now I see that the Ukraine scheme has a deliberate focus, admittedly on energy intensive small and medium companies, but it's there. And what I want to do is, based on that, Tadeusz, the white certificate scheme that you've presented, to what degree do they take into account the small and medium companies? I mean, is there any way that a white certificate scheme can actually have a stronger focus on the small, the SMEs, rather than typically on the larger companies? And what would your experience be there? Or would you have a kind of a specific perspective on that?
Okay, I think it is a good question. And once again, I must say how it was and how it is now. It was so that in the previous system, in the auction system, there was 80% of these white certificates allocated for each of these bids for this auction was reserved for these small companies. it was not written directly that they were small companies, but it was for the end users. And among the end users, there were very many small companies, but there was no special provision or something like this, which took a special advantage for these small companies. So the 80% for end users, but in the end users, there might have been large companies and small companies. And now in the new system, there is no as I said, every energy efficiency investment is eligible for a white certificate. So there is no any incentives or any protection of any advantages for the small companies. Of course, as it is typical in all countries, the small companies are not so well prepared. They have no resources for taking part in this white certificate system, so that naturally the big companies, they have the advantage, especially in this case when there is no additionality requirement. So without this additionality requirement, I think the big companies are in more privileged situation.
Okay, I mean, it seems to be a common challenge. SMEs, there's no doubt about it. And it's actually a point we discussed a lot yesterday in the sessions, dealing with SMEs and engaging with them. So I won't elaborate too much on this. However, we have a few minutes left, and I want to bring up a point that I raised during the presentations, the monitoring, reporting, and verification topic. This was raised in all of the presentations as a complexity, as an issue, how do we get it right, etc. And one of the points I took is that in every country, we use different indicators. We have different metrics, we have different ways of applying monitoring and verification. And this is sometimes a bit complicated, especially for larger companies that operate in different countries, and actually also sharing experiences. How do we share experiences if we use different indicators and metrics? Jakob, taking into consideration that you're at the early stage of a voluntary agreement scheme with the Ukraine and these kind of topics of how do we do the monitoring and verification, what indicators should we use? How are you dealing with this challenge to really get the right approach on monitoring verification? And importantly, how are you considering looking to the future at digitalization, artificial intelligence, automatic reporting? How can that play a role in actually overcoming this complexity of good monitoring and verification?
Well, it can take on a very big role in this transition. One of the challenges that we have discussed during our project on Ukraine is that some of the energy consumption is not necessarily metered. So we don't know exactly how much energy these large enterprises or smaller enterprises actually consuming. So there's always this uncertainty, and in some way, this is not like a part of our task in this project, but it deserves some consideration, because in order to have this voluntary agreement scheme to work, we should think about possible technical solutions that can be applied. And you mentioned digital solution and digital meters. I think it can be a very good solution to some of these issues. Right now, we believe that we should measure the energy consumption on an annual basis. So probably we will not need to have very sophisticated metering system where government authorities can collect data hourly. So but what we need to do is to think about how we can monitor the energy consumption and also the emission of CO2 in order to develop a model or a scheme that will be as cost effective as possible. And that is one of the main challenges. And thank you for bringing it to my knowledge that we should carefully think about it. So it was a good point.
No, I think it's a point I think that has been universally raised by many people, and it's a complex one because it deals with confidentiality of data. Do I actually trust the government to give them automatic data? I ask it because from experience with a number of different companies as well as schemes, this is a very contentious point, especially for companies that have cross-border operations and are actually doing different metrics, different ways of reporting in different countries. And they're quite frustrated, it has to be said. And there's a lot of potential here to bring about a simplification of the system and using the right one. I think this idea of sharing experience, for example, the work that Andre has done, learning about the different voluntary agreements, understanding in the different countries, I think we've a bit of work to do to get this MMV system right so that it works in a simple way, both for large and small companies. So having taken the last words, I have also reached exactly 1:30 p.m., at which stage we need to close off this session. So what I would like to do on behalf of the audience who must unfortunately remain silent in this, I would like to congratulate all the panelists for a very, very good range of presentations, but also a very good discussion. I think we've raised points that we continue talking about. So please do use the chat function and answer any of the questions you would like yourself on the Q&A section. Please imagine a great applause from the audience right now. It's going strong and it's lasting a long time for all of you. So congratulations again on behalf of the audience. Thank you also to the audience for the participation and the questions. And I look forward to seeing all of you again at 2 o'clock for the next panel 1 session, which will be very, very interesting, talking about lessons learned from different experiences. So I encourage you to join the next session, as I guarantee you it will continue the great discussion we've been having. Thank you all, and until this afternoon.